The sound of gunshots echoed through the canyon as Violet Garrett huddled in the overturned stagecoach, her white wedding dress now stained with dust and blood that wasn't her own. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she pressed them against her ears, the memory of her fiancé James falling from the driver's seat still fresh in her mind. The April sun of 1885 beat down mercilessly on the Arizona territory, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding below. Violet had been traveling to Douglas, Arizona, to marry a man she'd only met through correspondence, a businessman named Harold Weber, who had promised her a comfortable life far from her impoverished existence in Boston. Now Harold lay dead alongside the coach driver, both victims of the ruthless gang that had attacked their journey and disappeared with the strongbox. Hours passed before Violet found the courage to crawl from the wreckage. She gathered what few possessions remained and began walking, the desert landscape stretching endlessly before her. Her throat had gone dry from fear and thirst, but more troubling was her inability to make a sound when she tried to call for help. The words simply wouldn't come, her voice locked away by the horror she had witnessed. By sunset, her legs could carry her no further. Violet collapsed beneath a gnarled mesquite tree, her wedding dress billowing around her like a ghostly cloud in the growing darkness. The distant howl of coyotes only deepened her terror as she closed her eyes, certain she wouldn't survive the night. Thomas Vaughn had been tracking the Dixon gang for 3 days, following the trail of robberies they'd left across the territory. As the most experienced deputy in the Pima County Sheriff's Office, he'd volunteered for this solitary pursuit while others focused on protecting the upcoming spring cattle drives. His keen eyes spotted the smoke from the stagecoach attack miles away, but he arrived too late to save anyone, or so he thought. The moon was high when he discovered the solitary figure beneath the mesquite tree. Approaching cautiously, rifle at the ready, Thomas was stunned to find a woman in a wedding dress, alive but seemingly unable to speak. Her eyes, wide with terror, told him everything he needed to know. "Miss, I'm Deputy Thomas Vaughn," he said softly, crouching beside her. "You're safe now. Those men are long gone." Violet's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She gestured frantically at her throat, her eyes filling with tears of frustration. Thomas nodded in understanding. "Don't worry about talking. Let's get you somewhere safe first." He helped her to her feet, noticing how she swayed from exhaustion. Without hesitation, he lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. "Hold tight, miss. There's a homestead not far from here. The Johnsons are good folks, they'll help us." As they rode through the night, Violet leaned against the stranger's chest, drawing strength from his steady presence. For the first time since the attack, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. The Johnson homestead was a modest adobe structure with a barn and corral, situated near a small spring that made farming possible in the otherwise unforgiving landscape. Martha Johnson, a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands, took one look at Violet and immediately set about preparing a bath and clean clothes. "Poor child," she murmured as Thomas explained what little he knew. "Robert," she called to her husband, "heat more water. And find some of Sarah's old things, they might fit this poor girl." While Violet bathed, Thomas told the Johnsons about the stagecoach robbery. "I'll ride to Douglas tomorrow to report what happened and send telegrams. Someone must be waiting for her." "What about her voice?" Martha asked, keeping her voice low. "I've seen it before during the war," Robert Johnson replied, stroking his gray beard thoughtfully. "Some soldiers would lose their ability to speak after seeing too much death. The mind protects itself in strange ways." "Will she recover?" Thomas asked. Robert shrugged. "Some do, some don't. Depends on the person and what happened to them. Patience is what she needs now. When Violet emerged from the back room dressed in a simple calico dress, her hair still damp from washing, Thomas was struck by her natural beauty. Without the dirt and fear masking her features, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 22 or 23, with honey blonde hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. Martha set a plate of food before her, and Violet nodded her thanks, her fingers tracing grateful patterns on the older woman's arm. Throughout the meal, Thomas noticed how her gaze kept returning to him, questioning and uncertain. "I'll be heading to Douglas tomorrow," he explained as she ate. "Was that your destination? Were you meeting someone there?" Violet nodded emphatically. "Your husband," Martha guessed. Violet shook her head, then pointed to her wedding dress which Martha had hung to dry. "Ah, to be married," Martha deduced. "The poor groom must be worried sick." A shadow crossed Violet's face and she lowered her gaze to her plate. "I'll make inquiries," Thomas promised. "For now, you should rest. You're safe here with the Johnsons." That night, as Violet lay in the small guest room, sleep eluded her. Images of the attack played over and over in her mind: James falling, Harold's surprised expression as the bullet struck him, the bandits' cruel laughter. She sat up, gasping silently, clutching the blanket to her chest. Outside her window, she noticed a figure sitting on the porch steps. Thomas had declined the offer of the barn loft, preferring to keep watch outside. The sight of him there, vigilant and steady, gradually calmed her racing heart. Thomas rode out at dawn, promising to return within 2 days. Violet spent the time helping Martha with household chores, grateful for the distraction. Though she couldn't speak, she found ways to communicate through gestures and expressions. Martha proved to be a patient companion, filling the silence with stories of her life on the frontier. "You know," Martha said as they hung laundry on the line, "Robert and I came out here 30 years ago with nothing but a wagon and dreams. Lost our first 2 babies to fever before Sarah came along. She's married now, living up in Tucson with 4 little ones of her own." The older woman glanced at Violet. "Life out here is hard, especially for women, but there's freedom in it too, a chance to become who you were meant to be." Violet offered a small smile, wondering if she would ever find such certainty about her place in the world. Thomas returned on the evening of the second day, his expression grim as he dismounted. After greeting the Johnsons, he asked to speak with Violet privately. They sat on the porch steps as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. "I made inquiries in Douglas," he began, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "Harold Weber's business partner confirmed he was expecting a bride from Boston when I told him what happened." Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He expressed condolences, but said the engagement was a business arrangement. "He offered to pay for your return journey to Boston." Violet's face fell. She had known her engagement wasn't a love match, but the coldness of the response still hurt. "I also sent a telegram to Boston," Thomas continued. "Is their family waiting for you there?" Violet shook her head emphatically. She had no one, her parents long dead, the boarding house where she'd worked as a maid her only home. "I see." Thomas placed his hat back on his head. "Well, you're welcome to stay with the Johnsons until you decide what to do. There's a stage coach to Tucson next week if you want to head east. Or—" He paused, meeting her gaze. "If you'd prefer, I could escort you to Douglas. It's a growing town with opportunities for a woman willing to work. The hotel might need help, or there's the new school looking for a teacher's assistant." Violet considered his words, uncertainty written across her face. She gestured to her throat, her frustration evident. "Your voice will return when it's ready," Thomas said with gentle confidence. "In the meantime, There are other ways to communicate. That evening, Robert Johnson produced a small slate and chalk from a trunk. Sarah used this for her schoolwork, he explained, handing it to Violet. Might be useful until your words come back. The simple gift brought tears to Violet's eyes. She immediately wrote, "Thank you for saving me," and showed it to Thomas. "I only wish I'd been there sooner," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. Over the next few days, Violet used the slate to share her story, how she'd been an orphan working in a Boston boarding house. How Harold's advertisement for a bride had seemed like her only escape from a life of drudgery. How she'd traveled across the country to marry a stranger. Thomas listened attentively, sometimes asking questions but mostly just giving her the space to express herself. "I was a fool," she wrote one evening as they sat watching the sunset. "No," Thomas disagreed. "You were brave. It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind and start anew." Violet studied him curiously, wondering about the man behind the badge. Sensing her interest, Thomas began sharing his own history, how he'd fought for the Union as a young man, how he'd drifted west afterward, unable to settle back into civilian life in Illinois, how he'd found purpose as a lawman in the Arizona Territory. "I've been chasing men like the Dixon Gang for 8 years now," he admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm making any difference at all." Violet wrote quickly, "You made a difference to me." The simple statement brought a smile to Thomas's weathered face. At 34, he'd long ago stopped thinking about marriage or family, focusing instead on his duty. Yet something about Violet's quiet strength and resilience stirred feelings he thought had died during the war. A week passed, and Violet still hadn't decided whether to go to Douglas or return east. Each morning, she tried to speak, pushing air through her vocal cords, but the words remained trapped. The frustration was overwhelming, yet the Johnsons and Thomas never showed impatience with her silence. One evening, Thomas found her sitting alone by the spring, tears streaming down her face. "What is it?" he asked, settling beside her on the grass. She wrote shakily on the slate, "What if my voice never returns? Who would want a mute wife? How will I survive?" Thomas read her words carefully. "Your voice will come back," he assured her. "But even if it didn't, you're still the same strong woman who crossed a continent alone. You'll find your way." His confidence bolstered her spirits, and as the days passed, Violet found herself falling into a comfortable routine at the Johnson homestead. She helped Martha with cooking and mending, joined Robert in tending the vegetable garden, and spent evenings on the porch with Thomas, communicating through her slate and gestures that became increasingly expressive. Thomas had extended his leave from the sheriff's office, ostensibly to recover from his pursuit of the Dixon Gang, but really to remain close to Violet. He found excuses to delay their departure: a horse that needed resting, rumors of bandits on the road, a spring storm brewing. The truth, which he barely admitted to himself, was that these quiet days with Violet had become precious to him. 2 weeks after her rescue, Thomas suggested a ride to a nearby mesa where wildflowers bloomed after the recent rains. Martha packed them a lunch, her knowing smile suggesting she understood the growing attachment between the deputy and their silent guest. The April day was perfect: clear skies, gentle breeze, and the desert alive with color. Thomas helped Violet onto a gentle mare borrowed from the Johnsons, then mounted his own horse. They rode side by side, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. At the mesa, they spread a blanket among the wildflowers and unpacked the lunch. Violet's face was more relaxed than Thomas had ever seen it, her eyes bright with simple pleasure. When a jackrabbit startled nearby, she silently laughed, her shoulders shaking with mirth. "You have a beautiful smile," Thomas said without thinking. Violet blushed, lowering her eyes. After a moment, she picked up her slate and wrote, "You never ask why I agreed to marry a man I didn't know." Thomas considered her words. "I figured you had your reasons. Everyone out here is running from something or towards something." She nodded, then wrote more. "My employer's son at the boarding house, he wanted things from me. When I refused, he threatened to have me fired. Harold's letter came at the right time." Thomas's jaw tightened at the implication. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Violet shrugged, then wrote, "What are you running from?" The direct question caught him off guard. He looked away, watching an eagle circle overhead. "Memories, I suppose. The war showed me the worst of humanity. Out here, I can focus on bringing some justice to the lawless places." Violet studied him thoughtfully, then wrote, "And what are you running toward?" "I used to know," he admitted. "Now I'm not so sure." They sat in contemplative silence, watching the sun begin its descent. As they packed up to return to the homestead, Thomas impulsively picked a bouquet of wildflowers and presented them to Violet. Her delighted smile was all the thanks he needed. The next morning, as Thomas helped Robert repair a fence, the older man brought up what had been on everyone's mind. "You can't keep her here forever, son. The girl needs to decide her future." Thomas drove a nail with more force than necessary. "I know. I'm riding to Tucson tomorrow to follow up on some leads about the Dixon gang. I thought I'd take her with me, let her see the city, maybe find work there if she wants." Robert gave him a knowing look. "Is that all you're hoping for?" Thomas wiped his brow, avoiding the older man's gaze. "I barely know her." "Sometimes you don't need words to understand a person's heart," Robert replied sagely. That evening, Thomas told Violet about his plans to ride to Tucson. "Would you like to come along? It's a 2-day journey, but the town has more opportunities than Douglas. You could stay at the women's boarding house while you look for work." Violet considered the offer, then wrote, "What about the Dixon gang? Will you be hunting them?" "Eventually," Thomas admitted. "First, I need to report to the sheriff and gather information." She hesitated, then wrote, "I'm afraid to be alone again." The vulnerability in her admission touched Thomas deeply. "You won't be alone," he promised. "I'll make sure you're settled before I return to my duties." The journey to Tucson began at dawn 2 days later. Martha had packed provisions for the trip and given Violet a bundle of clothes and necessities. "You're always welcome here," the older woman said as she embraced Violet goodbye. "Remember that." The first day of travel passed uneventfully. Thomas kept a steady pace, always alert for danger, but also making time to point out interesting landmarks or wildlife. They camped that night near a small stream, Thomas building a fire while Violet prepared a simple meal from Martha's provisions. As they sat by the fire after eating, Thomas noticed Violet attempting to clear her throat repeatedly. "Are you all right?" he asked, concerned. She nodded, then wrote on her slate, "I can feel something changing in my throat. It doesn't hurt, but it feels different." "That's a good sign," Thomas encouraged. "Don't force it. Your voice will return when you're ready." Later, as they settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Thomas found himself watching Violet's peaceful face in the flickering light. The protectiveness he felt toward her had grown into something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in many years. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. The second day brought them within sight of Tucson by late afternoon. The city, with its mixture of adobe buildings, wooden storefronts, and church spires, sprawled across the valley floor. To Thomas, it was a familiar sight. To Violet, whose slate bore the word beautiful. When she showed it to him, it represented possibilities. They secured rooms at a reputable hotel, Thomas insisting on paying for Violet's accommodation. "Consider it an advance," he said when she protested. "Once you find work, You can repay me if it makes you feel better." The next morning, Thomas escorted Violet to the sheriff's office where he needed to file his report about the stagecoach robbery. Sheriff Benson, a gruff man with a silver mustache, listened to Thomas's account with growing concern. "The Dixon gang is getting bolder," he remarked. "First the bank in Nogales, now attacking stagecoaches. We need to stop them before they kill again." He turned his attention to Violet, who stood quietly beside Thomas. "And you, miss, are the only witness who's seen their faces up close." Violet's eyes widened with alarm. She hadn't considered that her survival made her a target. "She can't testify," Thomas said firmly. "She hasn't spoken since the attack." The sheriff frowned. "Even a written description would help. These men need to face justice." Reluctantly, Violet nodded and took the slate from her bag. Over the next hour, she painstakingly described the 3 men who had attacked the stage, coached their appearances, voices, and the distinctive scar one had across his cheek. "This is very helpful, Miss Garrett," the sheriff said when she finished. "But I should warn you, if word gets out that there's a witness, you could be in danger. The Dixon gang has informants everywhere." "I'll protect her," Thomas declared, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. The sheriff gave him a measured look. "You're one of my best deputies, Vaughn, but you can't be in 2 places at once. We need you on the trail." The dilemma hung in the air between them. Finally, Thomas said, "Give me 2 days to get Miss Garrett situated safely, then I'll join the posse." After leaving the sheriff's office, Thomas took Violet to the women's boarding house he'd mentioned. Mrs. Fletcher, the stern proprietress, listened to Thomas's explanation about Violet's situation without comment, then announced her terms. "I run a respectable establishment," she stated flatly. "First month's rent in advance. No men allowed past the parlor, and all residents must either work or be actively seeking employment. Your muteness will not excuse you from house chores." Violet nodded her understanding, but Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness. "Miss Garrett is an educated woman," he said. "She deserves to be treated with respect." Mrs. Fletcher raised an eyebrow. "Respect is earned in my house, deputy. Now, will she be taking the room or not?" Before Thomas could respond, Violet placed a gentle hand on his arm and nodded firmly. She wrote on her slate, "I can manage. Thank you for your concern." Thomas reluctantly paid for her first month's lodging, then helped carry her few possessions to a small room on the 2nd floor. The space was plain but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and window overlooking the street. "Are you sure about this?" he asked as Violet surveyed her new accommodations. "We could find somewhere else." She shook her head and wrote, "It's affordable and safe. I need to start somewhere." Her practical approach impressed him, though he couldn't shake his concern for her welfare. "I'll help you look for work tomorrow," he promised. The newspaper office mentioned needing someone who can set type, and the new hotel is hiring staff. Violet smiled gratefully, then wrote, "What happens after you join the posse?" The question had been haunting Thomas all day. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'll come back to Tucson when we've caught the Dixon gang. I give you my word." That evening, Thomas took Violet to dinner at a modest restaurant near the boarding house. The simple act of sharing a meal in public felt strangely intimate, especially when the waiter assumed they were married, and Thomas didn't correct him. As they walked back to the boarding house under a sky brilliant with stars, Thomas found himself reluctant to say goodbye. At the front steps, he took her hand impulsively. "Violet, He began, then faltered, unsure how to express the feelings that had grown during their short acquaintance. She waited, her eyes searching his face. "I want you to be safe," he finished lamely. "Promise me you'll be careful while I'm gone." Violet squeezed his hand, then wrote, "I promise. And you must be careful too. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." The simple statement gave Thomas hope that perhaps his feelings weren't one-sided. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, reluctantly releasing her hand. "We'll find you good work, I promise." The next day brought unexpected success. The proprietor of the Tucson Star, impressed by Violet's neat handwriting on her slate and quick intelligence, offered her a position setting type for the newspaper. The work would be tedious but steady, and the salary sufficient for her modest needs. "This is perfect," Thomas said as they celebrated over lunch. "You'll be working for one of the most respected men in town, and the newspaper office is just 3 blocks from your boarding house." Violet nodded happily, writing, "I start Monday. Thank you for helping me." Thomas smiled, though there was sadness behind it. "I leave tomorrow with the posse. Sheriff Benson thinks the Dixon gang is hiding in the Catalina Mountains. We could be gone for weeks." The news dimmed Violet's joy. She wrote slowly, "I will pray for your safe return." "I want to ask you something," Thomas said suddenly. "When this is over, when the men who hurt you are brought to justice, would you consider staying in Tucson, not just for work, but—" He trailed off, uncharacteristically nervous. Violet looked at him questioningly. "I know we haven't known each other long," he continued, "and I have no right to ask this of you, but I feel, that is, I've come to care for you, deeply." He took a deep breath. "I'm not proposing not yet. That wouldn't be honorable when you're still finding your way. I'm just asking if you might give me a chance when I return to court you properly." Violet's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. For a long moment she stared at him, emotions playing across her expressive face. Then, deliberately, she set down her slate and chalk. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and opened her lips. "Yes," she whispered, the sound barely audible. "Yes, Thomas." The simple word, the first he'd heard from her lips, struck Thomas like a physical blow. "You spoke," he said in wonder. Violet nodded, tears filling her eyes. "For you," she managed, her voice rusty from disuse. "My voice. For you." Thomas reached across the table, taking both her hands in his. "I'll come back to you," he promised fervently. "No matter what happens, I'll come back." That evening they walked slowly through the town plaza, savoring their last hours together. Violet spoke little, each word clearly an effort, but the simple fact that she could speak at all seemed miraculous to both of them. "How does it feel?" Thomas asked. "To speak again?" "Strange," she replied softly, "like waking from a long sleep." As they reached the boarding house for the final time, Thomas drew her into a secluded corner of the porch. "May I write to you while I'm gone?" Violet nodded. "I would like that." Impulsively, Thomas leaned down and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief, almost reverent, but it sealed the unspoken promise between them. "Wait for me," he whispered against her hair. "I will," she promised, her voice growing stronger with each word. Dawn found Thomas riding out with the posse, his thoughts divided between the dangerous mission ahead and the woman he was leaving behind. Sheriff Benson had assembled 8 experienced men, all armed and determined to end the Dixon gang's reign of terror over the territory. "You seem distracted, Vaughn," the sheriff commented as they rode. "That girl got you tied up in knots." Thomas smiled faintly. "She found her voice yesterday." The sheriff raised his eyebrows. "That's so. Well, don't get yourself killed out here. Sounds like you've got a reason to come back now." For Violet, the weeks that followed were a study in contrasts. During the day, she immersed herself in learning the newspaper trade, her nimble fingers quickly mastering the art of setting type, while her voice gradually recovered its strength. She made cautious friendships with 2 other women at the boarding house, and even began attending Sunday services at the small Episcopal church near the plaza. At night, however, she was haunted by fears for Thomas's safety and nightmares of the stagecoach attack. Often, she would wake gasping for breath, the memory of gunshots ringing in her ears. Only the letters from Thomas, arriving sporadically as the posse found ways to send messages back to town, brought her comfort. His words, plainly written but heartfelt, became her most treasured possessions. He described the beauty of the mountains, the camaraderie of the men, and his growing certainty that they were closing in on their quarry. Always, he ended with reassurances of his feelings and his intention to return to her. A month into his absence, Violet received a letter that made her heart race. "My dearest Violet, we have cornered the Dixon gang in an abandoned mining camp near the border. By the time you receive this, we will have moved in to capture them. Do not worry, we have the advantage of numbers and surprise. With luck, I will be returning to Tucson within the week, my duty fulfilled. I have thought of you every day, of your courage and your smile. The memory of your voice saying my name has sustained me through difficult nights. There is so much I wish to tell you, so many hopes I have for our future, but those words are better spoken face to face. Wait for me a little longer, my dear one. I am coming home to you. Yours always, Thomas." The letter sent Violet into a frenzy of emotions: hope, fear, anticipation. She read it so many times the paper began to wear thin at the folds. At work, she found herself making uncharacteristic errors as her mind wandered to Thomas and the dangerous confrontation he faced. "You're in love with him, aren't you?" her friend Clara asked one evening at the boarding house. "That deputy who brought you to town." Violet blushed but nodded. "Is it so obvious?" "Only to anyone with eyes," Clara teased gently. "He'll come back, Violet. He strikes me as a man who keeps his promises." 3 days later, word reached Tucson that the posse had engaged in a fierce gun battle with the Dixon gang. 2 deputies had been wounded, and one of the outlaws killed, but the gang's leader and his remaining men had escaped into Mexico. The news sent Violet rushing to the sheriff's office, her heart pounding with dread. "Thomas Vaughn?" she asked the deputy at the desk, her voice stronger now but still heavy with anxiety. "Is he all right?" Before the man could answer, a familiar voice called from the doorway behind her. "I'm more than all right now." Violet spun around to find Thomas standing there, dusty from the trail but wonderfully, gloriously alive. His left arm was in a sling and a healing cut marked his cheekbone, but his eyes were bright as they found hers. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, oblivious to the curious onlookers in the office. Then Violet was in his arms, mindful of his injury but desperate for the reassurance of his embrace. "You're hurt," she murmured against his chest. "It's nothing," he assured her. "A bullet grazed my arm during the fight. It's already healing." He drew back slightly to look at her. "Your voice, it's stronger." Violet smiled through her tears. "I've been practicing. The newspaper editor says I talk too much now." Thomas laughed, the sound rich with relief and joy. "I want to hear everything you have to say, for as long as you'll let me listen." Later, after Thomas had reported to the sheriff and cleaned up at his lodgings, they walked along the Santa Cruz River, catching up on the weeks apart. Thomas explained how the posse had tracked the Dixon gang through the mountains, following rumors and scattered clues. "We almost had them," he said with frustration. "If they hadn't posted a lookout, we would have taken them by surprise. As it was, we managed to wound their leader, the one with the scar you described, but he and 2 others escaped across the border." "Will you go after them?" Violet asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Thomas shook his head. "Sheriff Benson is coordinating with Mexican authorities, but for now my part is done. I've been given 2 weeks' leave to recover." He glanced down at her. "I thought perhaps we might use that time to get to know each other better." "I'd like that," Violet replied softly. The next 2 weeks were the happiest of Violet's life. Thomas called on her properly each day, taking her for rides in the countryside, escorting her to church services, and even attending a small concert held in the town plaza. They shared stories of their childhoods, discovered shared interests in books and music, and gradually built the foundation of something deeper than the initial attraction that had drawn them together. "You miss Boston?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat on a bench in the plaza. Violet considered the question. "I miss certain things, the libraries, the theaters, the changing seasons, but I don't miss the life I had there. I was always an outsider, even before my parents died." "And now," Thomas prompted, "do you feel like an outsider here?" She smiled, leaning slightly against his good shoulder. "No, for the first time I feel like I might belong somewhere." As Thomas's leave drew to a close, they faced the inevitable conversation about their future. On their last evening together, he took her to dinner at the finest restaurant in Tucson, then suggested a walk to the old mission at the edge of town. San Xavier del Bac stood brilliant white against the darkening sky, its twin towers reaching toward heaven. They walked the grounds in companionable silence, both aware of the significance of this moment. Finally, Thomas led Violet to a stone bench with a view of the valley and the town lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. As they sat, he took her hands in his. "Violet," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. When I'm with you, I feel a peace I haven't known since before the war." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I know our acquaintance has been unusual, even brief by some standards. But I believe what we've found together is rare and precious." Violet's heart quickened as she recognized the direction of his words. "I love you," Thomas said simply. "I think I began falling in love with you that first night at the Johnsons', when you showed such courage in the face of tragedy. I know now that I want to spend my life with you, if you'll have me." He released her hands only long enough to withdraw a small box from his pocket. Opening it, he revealed a modest ring with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Violet Garrett, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Violet's eyes as she looked from the ring to Thomas's earnest face. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it with me for years, waiting for the right woman to give it to." "It's beautiful," Violet said, admiring how the pearl caught the last light of sunset. "But Thomas, what about your work?" "The Dixon gang is still out there." Thomas's expression grew serious. "Sheriff Benson has offered me a new position, deputy sheriff here in Tucson. No more passes, no more weeks in the wilderness tracking outlaws. I'd be responsible for maintaining order in town, investigating local crimes." He searched her face. "It would mean a more settled life, regular hours, a chance to build a home together. You'd give up the hunt for the Dixon gang. For me," Violet asked, touched by the magnitude of what he was offering. "For us," Thomas corrected gently. "The truth is, Violet, the years of chasing vengeance have left me hollow. You've helped me remember there are things worth living for beyond justice and duty." He squeezed her hands. "Besides, other lawmen will continue the hunt. My priorities have changed." Violet leaned forward and kissed him tenderly, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they parted, she whispered, "When shall we marry?" "As soon as you wish," Thomas replied. "Though perhaps we should wait long enough to invite the Johnsons. They'd never forgive us if we didn't include them." "A month, then," Violet suggested. "That would give us time to prepare and for you to settle into your new position." "A month it is," Thomas agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. News of their engagement spread quickly through Tucson. The editor of the Star insisted on publishing an announcement, much to Violet's embarrassment, while her fellow boarders threw a small celebration in her honor. Letters were dispatched to the Johnsons, who replied with delighted acceptance of their invitation to the wedding. Thomas found them a small house to rent on the outskirts of town, a modest adobe with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a porch that caught the evening breeze. Together, they purchased simple furniture and the necessities for starting a home, each piece chosen with care and consideration for their future together. As the wedding day approached, Violet found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. The stagecoach robbery, which had seemed like the end of all her hopes, had ultimately led her to a happiness she could never have imagined with Harold Webber. Even her temporary muteness, frightening as it had been, had created the silent space in which she and Thomas had first connected. "Do you believe in fate?" she asked Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch of their future home. He considered the question seriously. "I believe that even in our darkest moments, there are opportunities for grace. Whether that's fate or providence or just the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, I can't say." He looked at her with tender affection. "But I do know that finding you has made me believe in second chances." The wedding took place on a perfect June morning in 1885, in the small Episcopal church Violet had been attending. Martha Johnson had helped her modify her original wedding dress, removing the stains and adding new lace to transform it into something beautiful rather than a reminder of tragedy. As Violet walked down the aisle toward Thomas, who stood tall and handsome in a new suit, she felt a sense of rightness that transcended all her previous doubts and fears. This was no marriage of convenience or escape. This was a union founded on mutual respect, shared experiences, and genuine love. Robert Johnson gave her away, his weathered face beaming with paternal pride. The service was simple but meaningful, with Violet's voice clear and strong as she spoke her vows. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with such tenderness that several ladies in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward, held in the garden of a prominent citizen who had offered the space, was a joyful affair. Townspeople who had come to know and respect both Thomas and Violet mingled with the few close friends they had made. The Johnsons, honored guests, regaled everyone with the story of how the couple had first arrived at their homestead. "I knew from the start these two belonged together," Martha declared, her eyes twinkling. "Even when this poor girl couldn't speak a word, they were having conversations with their eyes that spoke volumes." As the afternoon waned, Thomas and Violet bid farewell to their guests and departed for their new home. Crossing the threshold, Thomas surprised Violet by sweeping her into his arms, mindful of his healing wound but determined to honor tradition. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," he said, setting her gently on her feet in their small parlor. Violet's heart swelled at the name. "It sounds wonderful when you say it." Later that evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the desert in golds and purples, Thomas took Violet's hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Are you happy?" he asked. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she answered truthfully. "Are you?" "Completely," he assured her. "Though there is one matter that still weighs on my mind." Violet turned to him, concerned. "What is it?" "The Dixon gang," Thomas admitted. "I've accepted that hunting them is no longer my calling, but I worry about your safety as long as they're free. You're still the only witness who could identify them in court. They have no reason to know I'm in Tucson," Violet reasoned. "And even if they did, would they risk returning to a place where they're wanted men just for one witness?" "Criminals aren't always rational," Thomas said grimly. "Just promise me you'll be cautious, no traveling alone outside of town. No answering the door to strangers when I'm at work." "I promise," Violet agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But I refuse to live in fear, Thomas. We've both had enough of that in our lives." The first months of marriage were a time of joyful adjustment for both of them. Thomas adapted to his new position as deputy sheriff of Tucson, finding satisfaction in solving local disputes and maintaining order without the constant danger of his previous role. Violet continued her work at the newspaper while creating a warm and welcoming home. Their evenings were spent in pleasant domesticity, sharing meals, reading aloud to each other, and gradually building the intimate understanding that forms the foundation of a successful marriage. Both had lived solitary lives for so long that the simple pleasure of having a devoted companion seemed miraculous. In August, they received news that made their happiness complete. After several weeks of unexplained fatigue and morning illness, Violet consulted the town doctor. "Congratulations, Mrs. Vaughn," the elderly physician said with a smile. "You're expecting a child. I'd say you're about 2 months along, with the baby due in early spring." Violet could hardly contain her joy as she waited for Thomas to return home that evening. When he entered their small house, tired from a long day of patrol, she met him at the door with a radiant smile. "What is it?" he asked, immediately noticing her excitement. "Has something happened?" "Yes," Violet replied, taking his hands and placing them gently on her still flat stomach. "Something wonderful." Thomas's expression shifted from confusion to wonder as understanding dawned. "A baby, we're having a baby," Violet nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "In March, the doctor says." Thomas gathered her carefully in his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "A family," he whispered against her hair. "Our family." That night, as they lay together planning for their future, Thomas made a decision. "I'm going to build us a proper house," he declared. "Something with room for the children to grow." "Children," Violet teased, already planning for more. "At least 3, Thomas said confidently. "Growing up as an only child was lonely. I want our children to have brothers and sisters." Violet smiled, touched by his enthusiasm. "I'd like that too." In October, with Violet's pregnancy beginning to show, they purchased a small plot of land at the edge of town. With the help of friends and hired workers, Thomas began building their permanent home, a sturdy structure of adobe and wood with a deep porch, large windows to catch the breeze, and room for the family they hoped to raise. The work progressed steadily through the fall and winter, with Thomas devoting every spare moment to the project. By February, as Violet entered her final month of pregnancy, the house was nearly complete. "Just in time," Thomas remarked as they stood surveying the finished exterior. "Though I still need to build the cradle." "Martha sent a telegram yesterday," Violet told him, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "She and Robert are planning to visit after the baby comes. They want to see their grandchild, as Martha put it." Thomas smiled, pleased by the news. "We owe them so much. If they hadn't taken us in that night." "I know," Violet said softly. "Everything would be different." Their son, Samuel Robert Vaughn, was born on a mild March day in 1886. After a relatively easy labor, Violet held the dark-haired infant in her arms, marveling at his perfect features and strong lungs. "He has your eyes," she told Thomas, who sat beside the bed in a state of awestruck wonder. "And your determination," the midwife said. "She's rarely seen a baby arrive so quickly and decisively." Thomas chuckled, gently touching his son's tiny hand. "But he has your beauty," he countered, "and hopefully your gentle spirit." Parenthood brought new joys and challenges to their lives. Samuel was a healthy but demanding infant, requiring frequent feeding and attention. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, often walking the floor with his son in the early morning hours to allow Violet some rest. "I never imagined I could love someone so completely," Thomas confessed one night as they watched their sleeping son. "It's terrifying and wonderful all at once." Violet understood exactly what he meant. The depth of her feelings for both her husband and child sometimes overwhelmed her, especially when she remembered how close she had come to a very different life, or to no life at all, had Thomas not found her that night beneath the mesquite tree. The Johnsons' visit in April was a joyful reunion. Martha immediately took charge of the household, giving Violet much-needed rest while showering baby Samuel with grandmotherly affection. Robert and Thomas spent long evenings on the porch, discussing everything from cattle prices to politics. "You've done well for yourselves," Robert told them before departing. "Created something real and lasting. That's all anyone can hope for in this life." As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Tucson expanded around them. The railroad brought increased commerce and new settlers, transforming the frontier town into a growing city. Thomas was promoted to senior deputy, with increased responsibilities and salary, while Violet occasionally contributed articles to the newspaper in addition to her typesetting work. In the autumn of 1887, when Samuel was 18 months old, the past they had almost managed to forget suddenly intruded on their peaceful existence. Thomas returned home one evening with a grave expression that immediately alarmed Violet. "What's wrong?" she asked, handing Samuel to the young girl who helped with childcare while Violet worked. Thomas waited until they were alone on the porch before answering. "We received a telegram from the authorities in El Paso. They've captured 2 members of the Dixon gang trying to rob a bank there." Violet's hand went to her throat, a gesture she still made unconsciously when stressed. "What does that mean for us?" "They want you to come identify them," Thomas said bluntly, "to confirm they are the men who attacked your stagecoach." The request brought back memories Violet had worked hard to suppress: the sound of gunfire, the sight of blood on the desert sand, the terrible silence that had gripped her afterward. "Must I go?" she whispered. Thomas took her hands in his. "I won't force you. But without your testimony they might go free, and if they do—" "They could come after me," Violet finished, the old fear rising in her chest. "Or worse, they could threaten you and Samuel." "I would never let that happen," Thomas promised fiercely. "But yes, as long as they're free, we can never be completely safe." That night, as they lay in bed discussing the situation, Violet came to a decision. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I'll identify them, not just for us, but for the men who died that day, James the driver, Harold Weber. They deserve justice." Thomas pulled her close, his respect for her courage evident in his embrace. "I'll arrange everything. We'll take the train to El Paso next week. Samuel can stay with Clara and her husband. They've offered to care for him." The journey to El Paso was tense, with both Thomas and Violet aware of the potential danger. Though the captured men were securely imprisoned, their leader, the scarred man Violet had described, remained at large and potentially seeking vengeance. In El Paso, they were met by Marshal Dawson, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mrs. Vaughn," he greeted her, "I appreciate your courage in coming. This identification will be simple. You'll view the prisoners through a window. They won't see you." The jail was a stark stone building in the center of town. Inside, Marshal Dawson led them to a small room with a window covered by a sliding panel. "They're in the next room," he explained. "When I open this panel, you'll be able to see them, but they won't know they're being observed." Violet nodded, gripping Thomas's hand tightly as the marshal slid the panel open. On the other side of the glass sat 2 haggard men, one thin and wiry with a rat-like face, the other heavyset with a bushy beard. Instantly, Violet recognized them. "That's them," she said firmly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The thin one shot the driver. The bearded one took the strongbox." Marshal Dawson nodded in satisfaction. "That confirms it. We suspected they were Dixon's men, but without your identification, we couldn't be certain." He slid the panel closed. "Your testimony will ensure they hang Mrs. Vaughn." "What about their leader?" Thomas asked. "Any word on his whereabouts?" The marshal's expression darkened. "Nothing solid. Rumors place him in Mexico, but he could be anywhere. Rest assured, we'll continue the hunt." That afternoon, Violet gave her formal testimony before a judge, describing in detail the events of that terrible day. Thomas sat beside her, his steady presence giving her the strength to relive the trauma without faltering. "You should be proud," the judge told her afterward. "Few witnesses show such composure and clarity. Thanks to you, these men will face justice for their crimes." That evening, as they prepared to return to Tucson, Thomas found Violet standing by the hotel window, her expression pensive. "What is it?" he asked, joining her. "I was thinking about Harold Weber," she replied. "I barely knew him, yet his death changed the entire course of my life." She turned to face Thomas. "If the stagecoach hadn't been attacked, I would have married him. We would have lived in Douglas. I would never have met you." Thomas took her in his arms. "I've thought about that too. It seems wrong to find blessing in tragedy, yet I cannot regret the path that brought you to me." Violet rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "When I couldn't speak, when my voice was locked away by fear, you sat with me in silence until I found the strength to speak again. You gave me time and space to heal." "I would have waited forever," Thomas said simply. They returned to Tucson the next day, both feeling as though a shadow had been lifted from their lives. The trial of the Dixon gang members was swift, resulting in sentences of hanging for their crimes. While their leader remained at large, the threat he posed seemed to diminish with time and distance. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm for the Vaughn family. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's inquisitive nature. In the spring of 1889, Violet gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth Martha, honoring both Thomas's mother and the woman who had shown them such kindness in their time of need. "She's perfect," Thomas whispered as he held his newborn daughter for the first time. Just like her mother. As the children grew, so did Tucson. The frontier town of their early marriage gradually transformed into a proper city with paved streets, electric lights, and increasing amenities. Thomas eventually became sheriff when his predecessor retired, a position that brought respect and stability to their family. Violet's work at the newspaper evolved into a weekly column about family life and local history, allowing her to work from home while caring for the children. Her quiet eloquence and thoughtful observations made the column popular among readers throughout the territory. In 1892, their family was completed with the birth of their third child, another son they named William Robert. The boy was born with a full head of his mother's blonde hair and what the midwife described as a determined set to his jaw. "3 children," Thomas said with satisfaction as he gathered his family around him. "Just as we planned." "Are you sure that's enough?" Violet teased. "You're very good with them, Sheriff Vaughn." Thomas laughed, watching as 7-year-old Samuel showed his sister how to build a tower with wooden blocks. "3 is perfect," he declared. "Our family is complete." The years passed in a blur of everyday moments and milestone events: first steps, first words, first days of school. The children thrived under their parents' loving guidance, each developing distinct personalities while sharing the core values Thomas and Violet instilled in them. They maintained their connection with the Johnsons, visiting the homestead when possible and welcoming the older couple to Tucson for extended stays. When Robert passed away peacefully in 1895, Thomas and Violet brought Martha to live with them. Giving her a room of her own in the house, Thomas had expanded to accommodate their growing family. "You've given me a second chance at motherhood," Martha told Violet one evening as they sat mending clothes while the children played nearby, "and a purpose in my old age." "You gave us a home when we had nothing," Violet replied simply. "We're just returning the blessing." Martha lived with them for 3 more years before joining her beloved Robert in death. The family mourned her deeply, but found comfort in the knowledge that her final years had been filled with the laughter and love of children. As the turn of the century approached, Thomas and Violet found themselves reflecting on the journey they had shared. Standing on the porch of their home on New Year's Eve, 1899, they watched as their children set off small firecrackers in the yard under Samuel's careful supervision. "15 years ago, I was chasing outlaws across the territory with no thought beyond the next day," Thomas mused, his arm around Violet's waist. "I never imagined this life. 15 years ago, I was a frightened girl with no voice and no future," Violet added softly. "Now look at us." Thomas turned to face her, struck anew by the beauty that had only deepened with time. At 37, Violet's face showed subtle lines of experience and countless smiles, but her eyes remained as bright and expressive as when he'd first found her beneath the mesquite tree. "No regrets?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not one," Violet assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as their children cheered the arrival of a new century, full of promise and possibility. In the years that followed, they watched their children grow into adults who carried forward the values and strength they had instilled. Samuel followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a lawman with a reputation for fairness and integrity. Elizabeth, with her mother's gift for words, became a teacher and later principal of Tucson's growing school. William, the adventurous one, traveled throughout the West before returning to Arizona to start a successful ranch. Thomas retired as sheriff in 1910, after 25 years of service to the community. At their anniversary celebration that year marking a quarter-century of marriage, he raised a glass to the woman who had transformed his life. "To Violet," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered family and friends, "who found her voice to say yes to me, and who has filled my days with joy ever since." Violet smiled at her husband, the years falling away as she remembered the silent, patient man who had rescued her in more ways than one. "To Thomas," she responded, her voice clear and strong, "who sat with me in silence until I was ready to speak, and who has listened to me ever since." Their story became part of family lore, passed down to grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, the tale of a silent bride, and the cowboy who loved her enough to wait for her voice to return. Though details sometimes shifted in the retelling, the essence remained the same: a story of patience, courage, and a love that had begun in silence but spoke volumes through the years.